So in looking at the whole topic of prayer and trying to understand prayer from the looking at an overview in the Old Testament and an overview in the New Testament, this is how we will be approaching the topic for the next few live sessions. And so for this first session, what we'll be doing is just simply giving a broad overview of prayer as it relates to the Old Testament and how prayer was done there. And it's a very brief, a very broad overview. It's not a detailed study into prayer in the Old Testament. And one of the first interesting things that we find in the Old Testament is there seems to be not a specific um, time or a specific section in the Old Covenant where God taught people how to pray. When you read the Old Testament, it seems as if people just knew how to pray. They just prayed. Um, but even way back with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and so on, there seems as if there was not a time when God actually taught people and explained to people how to pray. And that's very important. That's very interesting. Prayer seems to be something that was just known. It was just it seems as if it was something that they knew that it had to be done, and it seems as in the Old Testament they knew that the way it was supposed to be done. Because when you read, especially in Genesis with Adam and Eve, the Bible simply said that God came down in the cool of the day and he spent time with Adam in the garden, Adam and Eve in the garden. And when you read later on, even after the sin and the fall and so on, especially with Abraham, the man who the Bible says is the friend of God, and even with David, there wasn't any specific time the Bible records where God actually sat down with them and taught them how to pray. It seems as if they just knew it. And so when we read the Bible, when we read especially in the Old Testament, what we read is an account of how people prayed, but not necessarily a teaching or a method given by God or even the prophets on how they should pray, on what prayer is. First of all, defining prayer and explaining what prayer is and how it should be done. So, if we were to look at the Old Testament to see a specific passage or a specific verse or a specific chapter that where God explains to the people in the Old Covenant, and even before the Old Covenant, in the time of Abraham, what prayers, we wouldn't find that. The closest we get to that kind of structure or that kind of direction in prayer is when we come to Moses and especially Leviticus, when the law was instituted and when God gave instructions in terms of how to bring the sacrifices into the temple. And together with those sacrifices, there was prayer. And you had times when there was intercession and praise and all these different things. That's the closest we come to really when we begin to talk about prayer and look at prayer in the sense of it being taught how somebody should pray in the Old Testament. And even that is not so much a teaching on prayer. That was really in Leviticus and Exodus and all these things. That was really God teaching them about sacrifices and how the sacrifices is what allows them to come to Him and to maintain that relationship with Him. And of course, the sacrifices pointed to Jesus. So even in that, we don't really have any, a teaching per se from the Old Testament on prayer. So again, what we have in the Old Testament is really an account of how people prayed. We have a series of accounts of how people approach God and how people spend time praying and talking to God. And that, if from looking at that, from studying that, is how we begin to glean or we begin to understand prayer, what prayer was and what it meant in the Old Covenant. It's only when we come to the New Testament with Jesus specifically in the Gospels, Jesus actually taught his disciples. Um, he gave the disciples a pattern to pray. And he didn't only teach them the pattern, but he actually exemplified it. He prayed, and many times in the scriptures we see him praying. And the disciples saw him praying as well. And then we have records of his prayer in the Bible, and so we could glean from the records in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, about how he prayed. But then he also gave a specific pattern for prayer. But like I said in the previous Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, it seems as if they just knew how to pray. And there wasn't at least in the Bible, in the Old Testament record, there's not a record of teaching how to pray. Now, they probably had a teaching that was passed down orally, or there was probably teaching about prayer in other writings that wasn't captured in the Old Testament. We also know that God gave Adam and Eve and people after them a record of what he wanted in the heavens. We know that God put his salvation plan, he put a record of himself in the stars in the skies and so on. And when you look at that, you see, when you begin to understand the planets, the stars, and how everything is organized, we begin to understand that God put in the stars the understanding of his will and his plans. And that's why, you know, the wise men could have studied the stars and know that Jesus was going to be born. And that's why so many other things in the Bible, we see records of where God put his plan and his teaching in the stars. So we know that God probably taught prayer to people in different ways. But the thing is, for our purposes here, it seems as if in the Old Testament there's not a, like a specific record, structured teaching about prayer. And so again, what that means is we need to really look at the accounts of prayers in the Bible, how prayer was done by different people, especially in the Old Testament, how they prayed. And then from that, we begin to glean the meaning of prayer, what it meant to people in the Old Covenant. And when we say Old Covenant, I think we need to explain something, we need to clarify something here very um, specifically and clarify this up front. What we call the Old Testament or the Old Covenant, the 39 books we have in our Old Testament, is really not accurate. The Old Covenant really started when Moses instituted the sacrificial system and the whole structure with the tabernacle, and that was in Leviticus. In Exodus, they came out of Egypt, but in Leviticus, everything was really enacted. So in Genesis and Exodus is really a time before the Old Covenant. So what we have in the books that we call today the Old Testament is really a record of the Old Testament as well as the things that happened before the Old Testament. So from the time God created Adam and Eve to the time Moses came and instituted the tabernacle, that time was actually not the Old Testament. That wasn't the Old Covenant. That was before. And then from Moses to Jesus was the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. And then when Jesus died, he instituted the New Testament or the New Covenant. So Jesus really lived under the Old Covenant. His death is what brought the New Covenant. So when we look at prayer, and when we look at the Bible and the record of prayer in the Bible, what we really are looking at is a record of prayer before the Old Covenant was instituted. That is in Exodus, in Leviticus. We're really looking at a record of prayer after the Old Covenant was instituted. And that's again in Leviticus. And then we're looking at the record of prayer and the presentation of prayer in the New Covenant. And that's when Jesus died. And so it's really three different eras. And there are specifics in each of those eras that we'll be looking at. So, for example, to give a broad overview of the Bible, a broad overview of the periods in time, you had the time when God created Adam and Eve and they were there on the earth and everything was perfect. And in that time, the Bible records how prayer was done. Actually, it didn't even term it as prayer, it was just God spending time with Adam and Eve. The Bible talks about in the cool of the day. And then you had the time after the fall when Adam and Eve sinned. And then you have a record of prayer and how it was done there. The Bible talk about men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Or another way that is translated is men began to call themselves by the name of the Lord. And so you had that time after the fall, after sin, when men began to, when sin was rampant and sin began to grow on the earth. But then you had prayer even in that as well. You had people like Enoch, Methuselah, of course, your people like Noah and all these others who spoke to God and had conversations with God. And then, of course, one of the greatest person in that period is Abraham. He was called Abram, and then his name changed to Abraham. Then he came along, and the Bible said that he was a friend of God. God um, addressed Abraham as friend. And we saw in that relationship between Abraham and God a dimension of prayer that was very interesting. It was a different kind of dimension as it was compared to previous people. So you had the time of perfection when Adam and Eve was there. Then you had the time of the fall afterwards with all these people, Noah, Methuselah, Enoch, and Abraham. And then you come forward to the time of Moses now, and to the time when God is going to call a people to himself, a people who came out of Abraham. And Moses is the person God chose. And then from there, you begin to see another dimension of prayer. The way prayer was done in the time of Adam and Eve before sin is different from how it was done in the time after they sinned, during that period when Abraham was there, from Enoch, Methuselah to Noah to Abraham. But then there was a change again in the way prayer was done when Moses came and he instituted the tabernacle. Because when that time came, that's when the old covenant was instituted. Prayer took on a different form. Instead of people calling on God individually and having, you know, personal places to go and pray, prayer was now confined to the tabernacle. And the people who were really responsible for doing that was the priests, the Levites, and even Moses himself was interceding on behalf of the people. And it's not that the people couldn't pray to God individually, but the emphasis in the Old Covenant was prayer being done in the tabernacle and being done by the priests. And so when we read prayer, we see prayer being done in different ways. It was practiced in different ways. But again, the thing that we don't see is a specific teaching in how it should be done. With Adam and Eve, there's no record that God taught them how to pray. It simply says that they prayed. God came down and he had um, communion with them or communication with them, and that was the full extent of it. There was no record that there was a teaching them how to pray. When Adam and Eve sinned, the Bible says that Cain and Abel brought their sacrifices. There was no record in the Bible on God teaching them how to bring their sacrifices. Now, we would obviously assume that Adam and Eve passed that information down to their children. They taught their children about sacrifices and so on. But at least in the Bible, there's no record of that. So again, in the Bible, there's no teaching about how the prayer should have been done even right after Adam and Eve sinned. And then when you come to Abraham, when you come to that period after the fall with all these other great characters, Enoch, Methuselah, um, Lamech, and all these others, there's no record there again of teaching. There's no record in the Old Testament, in our Bible. There may be in other extra biblical books, but not in the Bible that we have. When you look at Abraham and how Abraham spoke to God, the Bible says that God called Abraham when he was in Ur of the Chaldees. And that was it. The Bible didn't explain how Abraham knew that was God's voice. It didn't explain how Abraham knew to talk to God. The Bible just simply said God talked to Abraham, and that was it. And Abraham responded, and he left, and then he came eventually to Egypt, and then everything led to Moses many years later on. But it is interesting, the Bible doesn't give these details on how men knew how to pray. It didn't give the details on how prayer should be done. All the Bible simply did in these Old Testament books is simply to say that men prayed. That it happened. And so that to me is one of the first things that we need to take note of. That to me is a very, very interesting thing. Because prayer is the primary thing, the primary means by which we communicate with God. And we talk about that later on. And yet, for all the importance of prayer and for all of the significant priority that the Bible, we know we should put to prayer, there's no direct teaching in the Old Testament about prayer. And that's amazing. When we come to Moses and the tabernacle, that this is why I said we have probably the closest that it comes to with respect to teaching, the closest that it comes to with respect to teaching, and that teaching really with Moses in the tabernacle is when he instituted the sacrificial system. And in that sacrificial, there was a number of sacrifices. There was sacrifices. There were a number of holy days. There was a number of sacrifices to be done on the holy days, and there were sacrifices to be done by the people in Israel themselves. There were sacrifices to be done by the priests, by the leaders in Israel. There were a number of different sacrifices, and in those sacrifices, excuse me, or together with those sacrifices, what we have is also um, the explanation how prayer should be done when you bring those sacrifices. And that really is the closest we come to the teaching on prayer. In that sacrificial system, the focus of the teaching really was not on prayer. The focus was the sacrifice. The prayer was really what should be done when you bring the sacrifices to the priest in the tabernacle or later on in the temple that Solomon built. But the emphasis there was not prayer. The emphasis wasn't teaching on prayer. However, in the process of talking about sacrifices and in the process of talking about how the person who brought the sacrifices should come to God, there are explanations the Bible gives that helps us to understand prayer. It basically teaches prayer, but not as a direct emphasis or direct focus. So you would find when the Bible talks about bringing certain sacrifices, like there were guilt offerings and peace offerings and whole burnt offerings and drink offerings and all these different kinds of things. When the Bible talks about when you bring the offering, there are times it will tell you what you need to say and how you need to approach God and how you need to come before Him and what the priest would also do. And so, in that context, it teaches how prayer should be done. But again, the focus um, in that context is not so much a teaching on prayer. The focus is really the sacrifice. The prayer was to be made when the sacrifices are presented. And of course, for us, we know that the sacrifices represents Jesus. He is the one who ultimately um, typifies or satisfies everything that those sacrifices speak about. So, in talking about the sacrifices in the Old Testament, what God was really doing is pointing the people of Israel to Jesus. And in doing that, one of the things he was doing was telling people how to relate to Jesus, how to understand him, what he's going to do, what this whole sacrifice of Jesus is about. And then in an indirect way, he was teaching us about prayer as well, how to relate to Jesus and how to talk to him. And so this is one of the things we realize in terms of prayer, broadly speaking, in the Old Testament. In the Old Covenant, um, in the Old Testament, Israel, when they came out of Egypt and they came into the Promised Land, of course, they were in the midst of many other um, cultures around them. There was the Egyptians, of course, there was the Babylonians, there was the Sumerians. There were so many different people, and then they settled, of course, in Canaan. So they had so many neighbors in the Promised Land. And one of the interesting things is, if you look at the setting in that time, when God called Israel out of Egypt and brought them into the Promised Land, the nations or the cultures around Israel, they also had their own ways and systems of prayer. They had their own systems of sacrifices. They had their own systems of priests and temples and rituals and so on. They had their own structures of prayer. They had their own. Of course, these people were polytheistic people. They had many gods that they worship. And so, when Israel, especially with the time of Moses, when he instituted the old covenant system, that wasn't something that was completely new that they started. This whole sacrificial system, this whole means of approaching God and priests and so on. That was not a novel idea. It wasn't a new idea. It wasn't something that was, um, you know, fresh, and so on. Those things were actually being done by the people around them. What was distinctive and what was different about Israel is that Israel was a monotheistic people. They believe in one God. In Israel, they have something called the Shema, which is the declaration: Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God. And so the Old Testament system really wasn't a completely new thing. It wasn't a completely different thing. It was simply, um, in many respects, it continued what it I wouldn't say continued, but it had some elements that other cultures and other systems had, other peoples had. And of course, I said the main difference is that Israel was a monotheistic people. And so when Israel came and they set up their system, it was in many ways similar to what other people had. Even so much later on, when Israel wanted a god, a king, and God told yeah, Samuel, let them have the king. That was similar to how the other nations had it. The other nations had a worship system, Israel had that. The other nations had a temple system, Israel had that. The other nation had a god, but they had gods, Israel had a god, one God that they worship. And then the Israel saw the nations had a king, so they wanted a king as well. And God told them, go ahead. Because in that king, that plan was to bring Jesus as their king eventually. And so with prayer, the pattern and the way that Israel went about praying, many times you would see things in some ways similar to the other nations. So, for example, even the names that Israel has, like El and Yahweh, what we call Yahweh and so on, some of the names that Israel had for God and how they describe God, actually it had some similarities with what the other nations had. There were other nations that had beliefs in three gods who worked together, Ra and all these others in Egypt. There were some gods that they were there together. And so the point is there are some similarities even in the way that Israel described God, some of the terms that Israel used to describe God. Um, there are similarities that we could see with how Israel did it and how these other nations did it. And it's to show that Israel didn't really start a completely new, novel thing. In many ways, it was similar to how things were done before. But like again, one of the biggest differences is that Israel had a um, one God that they worshiped. It wasn't many gods. So by the time we come to the Moses and where things were really structured and ordered in the temple and in the sacrificial system and how they prayed and so on, you could see many of the things, the systems and the structures in Israel's worship also being practiced in other nations. Some of the names for God, some of the words describing God, similar to how the other nations describe them as well. And that's very interesting, that's very instructive because it seems as though the way even the heathen nations understood prayer, even the way that they approach prayer and so on, it seems as though they had um, the basis of their approach came from something that God passed on from Adam and Eve all the way down. So that even though the cultures and the nations around Israel were sinful, it seems that they still had in their you know belief system coming down, it seems that they had some form of godly or um, a godly inspired way of doing things. Because if it wasn't godly inspired, Israel could not have adopted it. But they did. They continued in some of the practices. And so this is where we are when we see the Old Testament. And then even after Moses instituted the sacrificial system and what we call the Old Covenant, then you move on from then to when Israel went into the Promised Land. Of course, Joshua took them into the Promised Land. And then you moved on to the time of the kings. like Saul and David and then Solomon. When you came into that time, you see prayer, especially with David, in a different way. Prayer with King David, and even before he was king, the psalmist David. Prayer was done in a very, very personal way. David reflected a very intimate, personal thing with prayer, just like how Abraham had a personal experience. But David seems to be even more intimate and more um, relational. So by the time you come to the kings, and especially David, you see prayer operating now in a sense, in a different way. Whereas with the Moses, or with the structure of the prayer and so on in the temple and the tabernacle, David took prayer to a place of real deep personal intimacy, a personal experience. And it shows how prayer and the understanding and the experience of prayer and so on was, there were some changes in it moving forward. So that even though there was not teaching, recorded teaching in the Bible about personal, intimate relationship with God and personal time with God, it seems as though it was still practiced because David is a good example of that. He had that personal experience with God and a very intimate relationship with God as well. And then, of course, you have all of the prophets. When you look at how the prophets, Elijah, Elisha, all of them, uh, Zechariah, of course, the great people, great prophets like Isaiah and all these others, Ezekiel, and even Daniel. When you move into that time period and you watch how they prayed, and not only prayed, but how they interceded as well for their people. When you begin to look at how they got their revelations from God and how they were able to listen to what God says, that also begins to show a different dimension of prayer as well. A dimension where God is not only able to speak to a person about that person um, alone, but God is also able to speak to the person about a whole nation and give a prophetic word to that individual about the entire nation. That's a different dimension. So we see prayer operating even in a different way as well there. It is God talking to one man about a nation and giving a man a prophetic word about a nation. And then you move even further now. After that, all of that, when Israel was carried into exile, when they were in exile in Babylon, and then of course, um, well, Judah and then they went into Babylon, but Israel went into Assyria. When during that exile period, there was no temple. Israel had no place to gather, so they had to go into their own prayers. Everybody, was individual prayers again. It was something like how it was before the old covenant was instituted. And then you see people getting back into prayer, but getting prayer in an individual. You see the prophets talking to the people, but it wasn't like how the old covenant was because there's no temple at that time. And then even after that now, when they were brought back into the land, that's after the exiles, they were brought back now into the land and they started to rebuild the temple. You see a focus there again. But with Ezra and Nehemiah, you see how they started to, how prayer was done in that time with Ezra and Nehemiah and how they interceded for the people and how God spoke to Ezra and Nehemiah and how they brought the people together is an even different way of prayer. And of course, that then brings us into the New Testament with Jesus. And you begin to see in the time of Jesus how prayer was done there, how the system was done there. There was something called the synagogues that was now established as opposed to the temple. The synagogues was a local place where they would meet. The temple was the place where the sacrifices was. And so in that meeting place, there was some emphasis there as well in prayer. So, in a broad way, prayer really, even though there in the old covenant there wasn't a specific teaching on how prayer should be done, we see prayer being practiced in that broad way we just spoke about, from Adam all the way up to at the time of Jesus. And you could see that men knew how to pray. They knew what prayer was. They knew how to pray. You see the development in prayer from one person talking to the temple where the priest was, and then to real intimacy with David, and even to the prophets where God could speak to the prophet about a nation and give prophetic words. And we see all these developments in prayer. And of course, what that helps us to do is to, when we begin to study the different examples of prayer, the different instances of people praying in the Old Covenant, it will give us an understanding of what they understood prayer to be. It will help us to really begin to see how God passed down the knowledge of prayer to them when we study how they practice it and what they did. And that's what we'll be doing. We'll be looking at how they practice prayer so that from seeing how they practice it, it could help us to understand their thinking behind prayer. And that's what we want. We want that thinking, what prayer is and how it should be done. And so this is where we will be heading. And so we'll be stopping here um, for this. And when we come to the next time, we'll be getting into the Old Testament. Well, what we call the Old Testament, time from Adam and even all the way up to Jesus. And looking at some more details with respect to prayer. More specifically, we'll be looking at prayer in terms of the sacrificial system, what God gave them in Leviticus, what these sacrifices are, what they mean, what they talk about Jesus, but then how they relate to prayer, what we could learn from that. So I'm hoping you join me for that for the next time. And until that time, thank you very much. And I pray God's blessings on you. Until then, take care.